Okay, well, we'll get started. Good morning. I know it is still morning in the UK in Oxford there, and my background is false because the sun is not up yet in Nashville, Tennessee, but I am still thrilled to be a part of this session. As you can see from our title slide, we're going to be talking today about the art and science making sense of the global evidence on outcomes-based contracting approaches. And so we have a really outstanding panel here this morning who I'm going to introduce in a moment. I think we're going to give some technical information before we do those introductions.
Thanks, Caroline. Just a quick reminder for everyone, to introduce yourselves on Zoom, make sure we can see your name and organization. Even those of you joining in Oxford, feel free to connect on Zoom, ask questions. We'll stop throughout the session to take questions, both from those in person with us in Oxford and from our lovely participants on Zoom. And with that, it's back to you, Caroline.
Great, thanks so much. So I'm just going to briefly introduce myself. I'm a professor of public policy education economics at Vanderbilt University, and I have been very pleased to be a part of some of the work that the Government Outcomes Lab has been doing on social outcomes contracting, or outcomes-based contracting, as we use both of those terms in this session here. And I am joined this morning by a really outstanding panel. I'm going to introduce each of them briefly. Elle Carter is the research director at the Government Outcomes Lab. In 2020, she was awarded a UKRI Future Leaders Fellowship to support research into complex public service contracting. And she is an amazing research leader at the GO Lab. I've had many wonderful interactions with Elle. We have Dr. Chi-Hoon Sin. He is the chair of Travers with around 20 years of commissioning support experience. So he is working on the commissioning side of outcomes-based contracting. And since 2011, he's been increasingly involved in different forms of outcomes-focused commissioning in the UK as well as internationally. We're also joined this morning by James Ronicle. James is a director at Ecoris. He leads on Ecoris's research into outcomes-based contracting. In the last 10 years, James has been involved in evaluating over 40 impact bonds across 4 continents. We also have with us Jessica Lopez. Jessica Lopez Taylor has 10 years of experience working on results-based financing at the World Bank with the Global Partnership for Results-Based Approaches. She focuses on blended finance as well as outcomes-based approaches, primarily in the infrastructure sectors. She's also working on one of the World Bank's early impact bond projects in the education sector in Ghana. And then we will also hear today from Jonathan Ng. Jonathan is currently the acting director of the innovation division at USAID. He's been involved in impact investment in social entrepreneurship space since about 2007, and has experience working in the private, NGO, and government sectors. As a lawyer, he believes that form follows function. As an innovator, he believes the term innovation is often overused. And as a grant maker, he believes that evidence-based grant making should be more of the norm, not the exception. So as you can see, we have a really outstanding panel today. And I'm just going to begin by giving a few kind of overview remarks to set the tone for our discussion, and then you will hear from the various panelists. So first of all, just a few quick notes on where we are today in relation to our longer term study of outcomes-based contracting in the public sector. So actually, this is not a really new topic. We actually have 4 decades of knowledge building and experience with outcomes-based public sector contracting. If you consider when we literally started doing the outcomes-based public sector contracting in both the UK and the US. And so, over time through research, we have documented many of the challenges that we are still encountering today. So you'll hear about the challenges of aligning diverse public and private interests and goals in the form of something that is contractual and can govern an arrangement going forward. There are important technical and operational skills that need to be developed for managing these complex contracting structures, especially when we're bringing in outcomes orientation. As we are all learning, and as the Go Lab has been a really important contributor, it takes a lot of work in assembling the data and infrastructure that is required for monitoring and analysis of these contracts if we're really going to understand how they're working and pursue these different innovations in public sector contracting. And importantly, as you'll hear from some of our speakers today, it also requires managing political and strategic demands of the partnerships, which are complex in of themselves. And this also requires attending to many of the informal aspects of contracts, not just the technical details, the paper, or other forms in which we agree to, but things like culture, norms, and the ethics, which may vary in terms of values that different partners bring to contracting. But I also want to highlight that so we have this strong base of knowledge which we build on, but going forward on the slides, we have new models that we have been experimenting with. And I think this is where, the Go Lab has been really important in bringing all of us together, those of us in academia, in practice, and, in the public sector, figuring out how we take outcomes-based contracting or social outcomes contracting to the next level. And so what we've seen is we have been pushing to contract on strong evidence-based models with the hope that this is going to help us achieve better results through, higher model fidelity and better actual programs and service delivery models. We've also been aiming to more effectively incentivize innovation and efficiency, not only in the contract terms themselves, but also in how partners work together, because there's shared responsibility in these arrangements, which we'll be talking about today. We've also had, I would say, an ambition to define impact measures and contracts on well-defined long-term outcomes and impacts. But whether or not we've actually been able to realize in practice, I think, is still a question which we will be talking about. And lastly, I just want to point out that we're on this continued quest for ways that we can strengthen public sector capacities, as well as those of the partners of the public sector, and consider whether or not there are, in fact, are there prototypes or models for successful outcomes-based or social outcomes contracting that we can consider valuable to disseminate around the world. So in our conversations among the panelists in preparing for this session, it occurred to me that there was a meme I had seen previously that I thought nicely fit, where we think we are today. So how are we doing on those efforts to take, outcomes-based contracting to the next level? So first of all, there's our aspiration, which might be, for example, the prototype or model you've developed, which is sleek, well-defined, attractive to investors, whatever you want to say. This is how we see our models. And then, as we'll talk about today, the reality and practice often looks something different. And so this is maybe the messy reality that we've come to appreciate. And of course, one of the reasons we come to this conference is so we can understand better about, what is that reality and can we do better going forward. So I'm now going to turn it over to the first panelist, and that will be Elle Carter.
Thanks, Carolyn. I wonder, James, did you want to kick us off, actually?
Thanks, Elle. I was just going to build on some of what Carolyn said and sort of introduce where our ambitions in terms of the systematic review and looking at the evidence base around social outcomes contracting that we started on last year. So we brought together last year, late 2020, early 2021, we brought together 35 funding organizations from across the world responsible for social programs, funding social programs that have either expended a significant amount on outcomes-based contracting, intended to, or had considered doing it. What we wanted to understand further was how decisions were made on whether to do outcomes-based contract, what form to use, and how evidence the evidence base sitting underneath these was kind of built in, and how that was used and reviewed, and how that helps informing decisions. This group 35, it consisted of governments such as UK, Japan, Russia, Abu Dhabi, multilateral organizations, the World Bank, European Commission, bilateral donors like USAID, Global Affairs Canada, and NGOs as well, like the National Lottery Community Fund. One of the first things we asked these 35 organizations was, what different forms of social outcomes contracting did they use, or were they aware of? We were aware of some, but we, as Carolyn said, we were also very conscious that different types are being used all over the world. And so one of the first questions we asked them was, please tell us, and we listed all the different forms of social outcomes contracting that they were using or were aware of. Now, before I tell you or show you the list that we compiled, I'm actually curious to know, this is a group of social outcomes contract people interested or do social outcomes contracting. I'm quite interested to know what the audience says when we say, can you tell us all of the different social outcomes contracting? So I'm going to do a quick experiment. What I want everybody to do in the room and online, I want you to grab a piece of paper and a pen, or use your laptop. I'm going to give you a minute, and I want you to list all of the different types of social outcomes contracting that you either use, have been involved in, or are aware of. And I'm not in Oxford right now, but I'm going to buy a drink to the person that is able to come up with the longest list when we hopefully are going to all be in Oxford next year. Because I provided an incentive, this has now become an outcomes-based commitment. I therefore probably should define what I'm talking about. So when I say social outcomes contract, because this is important, because I think it was misinterpreted yesterday, we're talking about funding flows of money from one organization to another organization. So we're not talking individual level, we're talking organizational level. And a part of that money is contingent on performance. So that's what we mean by social outcomes contracting in this context. So I am going to give you 1 minute to name as many social outcomes contracting or terms that refer to social outcomes contracting as you can think of. And that minute starts. Okay, that is your minute up. I'm going to use the chat. I would like everybody to put the number that they reached in the chat. We will see who got the highest number. So,
James, we have a Jamboard as well, so people have been adding their
okay.
Jamboard. So maybe Juliana, we can get that up on the screen so that everyone can see it. Just please give us another minute, James.
Okay. Okay, so we've got 2 different forms now. So I've got 13, I think is the highest number. Oh, 15. Richard Johnson has outbid Louise. 15 looks like. How many are here on the Jamboard? 6, 7. Okay, Richard, I think based on what we've got so far, you might be the winner of the contract. However, again, because this is an outcomes-based agreement, I'm going to have to validate your claim. So, Richard, would you unmute yourself, please? I'd really like to hear. Could I hear your list of 15, please?
Richard, are you happy to share?
I'll just do it from here, yeah. Well, there's hundreds of them, for goodness sake. In employment services, there are employment zones. Private sector had a alleged New Deal, flexible New Deal for disabled people, the work program. They all started back in the day in Wisconsin with the first welfare to work programs, which were outcome-based. The whole employment services system in Australia is a social contract. Then you've got all of the SIBs, and the SIBs I've been involved in. So right now, KBOP, ships in London, ships in Norfolk, carer support in Norfolk, Palestinian Development Impact Bond, Local Solutions Homelessness Program, Energize, which was one of the DWP, and Teens and Toddlers, and I counted that twice because there were two of those. That's 15.
Thanks, Richard. I actually meant different types of social outcomes contracting rather than.
Well, you didn't define your criteria.
I clearly didn't define it, and this is one of the lessons we've all learned over the years. I clearly did not define my my criteria correctly, so I will still buy you a drink. I probably should buy Louise a drink as well because she came second, I think, but possibly stuck to. But yeah, thank you. Okay, so Richard had 15, Louise had 35. Juliana, if you wouldn't mind stopping sharing the Jamboard, and if you just pull up slides 7. We identified 35. That was through the speaking to these 35 organizations. These were the English terms. We also asked for these terms used in different languages. When you include these terms or different models used in different countries with different languages, we actually reached 65. But what was unclear to us, so we almost have this patchwork quilt of different types of outcomes-based contracting. What was unclear to us, though, was are these actually different forms of outcomes-based contracting or social outcomes contracting, or are they very similar, but just using different languages and slightly interpreted and used in different ways in different contexts? What was also clear when we were talking to the funding organizations was that these different tools have been used for different periods of time and have different evidence bases behind them. PPPs, performance public-private partnerships, have been around for multiple decades. Social impact bonds now been around for a decade. Some things only been around for a couple of years, like social success notes. And we're also seeing new things that were still in development that hadn't yet launched in places like Australia and Abu Dhabi. So there's a very different types of outcomes-based contracting evolving and being used in different ways. And therefore, the evidence base underpinning some of these also differs. Some of these have large amounts of research and evidence. Some of these that don't even exist or only launched a few years ago have very light evidence underpinning them. And what we also found when we talked to different funders was different people sort of come at this patchwork quilt from different places or different angles. They might have a very good understanding of one particular form of social outcomes contract, but not necessarily some others. Or they might have great understanding of a wide range, but only how they've been used in particular contexts or particular locations, and not how they've been used in other places as well. So this was almost a patchwork quilt that had no threads tying it together. There was nothing that sort of linked or pushed all of these and tied them together. So there's a great understanding of how they all interrelated. And therefore what people were sometimes saying how do they use evidence base when deciding what types of social outcomes contract to use, how to design it, often they were following their noses based on their experience of using these other places, based on talking to other people that might have used other forms, but there was no way of really looking at and understanding all of the different types of social outcomes contracting. Our interpretation of why that was the case is because the evidence base behind all these different types of social outcomes contracts is dispersed. They're in different places, it's in different languages, and no one has ever sort of pulled the thread of all these different types of social outcomes contracting together, looks at all the evidence base behind them, and look at how they all build on each other, compare. Some might outperform others in different places. That had never been done before. And that's what that's our intention that we began last year, that we're partway through, to look at all of the evidence of all types of social outcomes contracting in all parts of the world, in all languages. Such an endeavor could not be done by any single organization. So Chorus and GoLab partnered together on this task. And I'm going to hand over to Elle to sort of give us an update on where we've got to and how we're getting on.
Yes, so how to respond to this very patchy patchwork quilt. So we launched a global systematic review to look at these forms of social outcomes contracts. As James mentioned, this is a hugely ambitious project. We're aiming to pull together every empirical paper on any form of social outcomes contracting published since 1990 in any language. So it's a big team effort, and we have a really great team from the GoLab and from Ecoris working together on this. And our ambition is to collect and pull information from these studies in a way that supports policy decision-making, but also enables further synthesis and distillation by researchers. So this is a really critical exercise in finding out what we really do know, the frontier of our cumulative knowledge on social outcomes contracting. And in this talk, I hope to cover three things. Firstly, why a systematic review, an overview of what we've been up to, and then a little bit of what next, as we're really only just rolling up our sleeves on this project. So perhaps to begin, why a systematic review? And I have this great quote from Ben Goldacre, who says, instead of just mooching through the research literature, consciously or unconsciously picking out papers here and there that support our pre-existing beliefs, we take a scientific and systematic approach to the very process of looking for evidence, ensuring that our evidence is as complete and representative as possible of all the research that has ever been done. So a handy quote from Ben there. So we're thinking about this as being systematic, explicit, and accountable in how we go about this research project. And to illustrate the value of this, I wanted to tack back to one of the provocations from yesterday's keynote with Professor Stiglitz around microfinance, a notoriously complex intervention. But if you look at a single study of microfinance, you end up with a specific but quite partial picture. And it's only through systematic reviews that synthesize findings across multiple studies that we begin to build up this really rich picture to appreciate the underpinning assumptions, the different mechanisms around what works for whom and when. So that's really the power of a systematic review, is this synthesizing to really unpick and understand the variation in these complex world of outcomes contracting. So for outcomes contracting, we've got this swirling world of an overwhelming number of terms and certainly an overwhelming number of papers and empirics that may or may not be relevant to different policy questions and different challenges. So how to move through this and make sense when there are more studies than one person can ever read. So here's a quick 2-minute overview of the approach that we have taken to the review so far. So on the left-hand side of this slide, we have the key steps in any systematic review process. We begin by defining our questions and scope. We then search for studies. We then map those studies, describe those studies, and assess their quality and relevance. And then we finish with our synthesis, mapping, producing policy resources, and a rundown of our journey so far. It's been more difficult than we thought it was going to be, but we've had great support along the way with our policy advisory group. So this group of global policymakers have really helped to shape our priority research questions and scope. They were insistent that this wasn't just a does it work type review. They had a real ambition to try and understand the contexts, the constraints, and the appropriateness around the different experiences of using outcomes contracts. They also insisted that the review was global in scope and that we didn't restrict to English language publications. So we've been incredibly ambitious in the breadth of this review. And we've prepared inclusion criteria to try and capture papers that offer an empirical contribution around a form of social outcomes contracting. And we've narrowed that slightly to think about organizational level outcomes contracting, particularly when we have independent provider organizations. So that might be private sector, it might be not-for-profit sector delivery providers. In our search, we were very thorough in our terminology, supported by our advisory group. And Vanessa Picker, a PhD student here, helped us search 12 different bibliographic databases to pick up the academic papers. And the advisory group also insisted that it was important to pick up information beyond academic publications. So this is sometimes referred to as grey literature, but it's all the good stuff that gets published from consultancies, different research teams going onto government department websites. So we've also had a very proactive strategy to draw this information in using targeted web searches. We had an open call for papers and submissions, and then some very targeted searching on specialist websites like Social Finance, Pay for Success in the US, and so on. So we've identified 11,233 potentially relevant papers. You don't have to read these because we've done it. We've read the titles and the summaries of all of these papers, and the amazing screen team have been very diligently screening out to identify the most relevant papers. And we're currently at 2,082 papers that we have narrowed as our pool of potentially relevant studies here. So our next step is to capture and organise and try and begin to present these papers. We're thinking about this as a map, really a tool to help us navigate through this still quite chunky volume of research papers and findings. So this is a navigation tool that can help us zoom in on a particular question or particular themes. And we think of this map as a precursor to a series of different reviews and syntheses, or helping to answer different policy questions on particular issues. Our first opportunity to use this is in a piece of work supported by the REACH team at the World Bank, who have particular interest in the use of outcomes contracts in education in low and middle income countries. So we're working with that team to zoom in and focus on a particular portion of the papers that we've identified. But we really hope that more synthesis will follow, and we can work with teams to understand more specific questions and the available evidence that we can use to plug in and respond to those. I should also say that we plan to use machine learning to speed up parts of this review process, which is quite experimental and cutting edge, but we hope that this will help us keep the review up to date and provide supplementary text and data analysis tools so that we can start to think about zipping these papers together, so connecting these empirical papers with other bits of data. So thinking about the impact bond database and bringing those evidence and project details together, or maybe think about looking at particular contracts and attaching the empirical evidence, or procurement notices and joining up there. So, as we said, we've been incredibly ambitious with this review. We are nowhere near finished, but we're at a bit of an inflection point where it'd be really helpful to get comments and feedback from the community around this subject area to help us really focus and shape the types of tools that we produce over the coming months and years. We're building a prototype, a little toy, to give you a bit of a flavour to start off with what we might be able to do. So humour us, we've coded just 12 studies here and started to categorise these. We've applied an independent critical appraisal tool to give you a sense of the soundness of each paper and how it describes its methods. We describe each type of study, that might be qualitative, quantitative, or mixed methods. And you can click on a cell to identify the papers that meet particular criteria. So maybe you're interested in qualitative studies of social outcomes contracting in a low-income context. As you scroll down the page, I should say this is all live, by the way, and you can check this out on the web link in the chat. Thanks for sharing that, Mara. So as you scroll down the page, you can see the filters for different policy areas, classified by the Sustainable Development Goals. Maybe the type of delivery actor involved is important to you, and we can begin to code that in more detail. And then, ding, the papers should be there at your fingertips. So you have details of each paper and a link to follow through if you want more detail on that. So a very tiny, very emergent toy that might help get some evidence into the right place at the right time. But there might be more that you want to see. So taking inspiration from other places for evidence navigation, you might want a different map that helps you zone in on particular themes, different geographical regions, experience of different tools. filtering by date, or maybe there's something a little bit more subtle in terms of the context of these different outcomes contracts, please tell us what would be helpful and put this into the chat, or you can send us an email. Our question really is this going to help? What would good evidence-led policy making look like in the world of social outcomes contracting? Thank you.
Okay, so thank you so much, James and Elle, for an excellent presentation of this super ambitious initiative. But I have to say, one of the things that we should compliment you on is your transparency in, like, most of the time we wait for these systematic reviews to shine the light on things when they're actually published, and you are sharing it with us as you build it and actually offering input into your approach. So I think that's pretty exciting. I did see a question in the chat. Actually, I thought were two questions that were somewhat related. You did mention in your describing your model that you do evaluate the quality of the evidence. And so one of the questions asks about an evaluation matrix for that work. And, the related question was kind of considering evidence quality, what are some of the things that you are looking for, and how kind of inclusive are you attempting to be? I mean, I think some of us have seen those meta-analyses that start like you did with thousands of studies, and they end up with, 40 studies at the end, and you're always wondering what was dropped and why. So I think, you're already being very transparent here. Maybe if you could say something about your evaluation matrix, if you have one.
Thanks, Carolyn, and thanks for that question. It's something that we're developing. One of the things that I think is informing this is that we want to be as inclusive as possible and have incredibly broad questions. So we're not cutting out studies on the basis of their design or on the basis of the quality of their methods, provided that they offer an empirical contribution to this space. We are keeping them in, and we're trying to use this critical appraisal tool as an indicator of how, I suppose, the soundness of the study. This is quite tricky because some of what we're including is not a formal research output. It's not necessarily written up as an academic paper. And so I should say that just because a paper has sort of some concerns around it, it's not necessarily a question on the integrity of that paper. It's just, has it described its own research methods? Can you be confident in the way in which that research was conducted and whether the findings hold in relation to that study design? And we're also being very inclusive in terms of the nature of the study. So we have, I suppose, when you see systematic reviews that really narrow down and have just 3 papers, is because they're being very specific about the type of paper that they want to see. So they might just be looking for RCTs. We're not doing that. And you can see a real range and variety of papers coming through. So hopefully policy teams can use different types of papers in response to different questions, depending on whether their question is around effect or something more to do with context and relationships around a particular project.
Yeah, just to build on that, as you're saying, Carolyn, a typical systematic review, you probably end up with about 100, 150 papers after you've screened it. And in many ways, that was our working assumption when we started on this, but we, as you will have seen, we have 2,000 currently. And we could, if we wanted, tighten our quality criteria to reduce that number down, which would make things much easier for us. But we deliberately haven't done that for exactly the reasons that Elle said. The challenge that creates, which I think is what Jared was saying as well, is that both we as a team, but also the readers of this can become overwhelmed by the sheer scale of this evidence. So the one thing that we're really grappling with, which is sort of what the heat map that Elle was showing, was how do you distill and synthesize and present all of this evidence in a really accessible way? Our kind of working hypothesis at the moment is that what we're not going to reach, there is no like one answer of what works. These are different mechanisms. They're used in different contexts with different aims. So in many ways, what we're not trying to do is read 2000 and give you the answer of 42. We want to help people sort of curate the evidence in terms of, okay, you're interested in this types of outcomes-based contracting, in this type of location, in this type of policy area. Well, if you use the map, these are the 7 studies that will really, are very similar to what you're trying to achieve. So one of the things we're trying to do is help people sort of navigate so that they don't become overwhelmed with 2000 studies.
Yeah, and the format that you're using really does make that possible, I think, which is exciting. So, I would encourage those who are interested to definitely check it out online. I don't see at the moment any new questions, so I'm going to go to the panelists with a first question. Oh, you have one?
No, I was just going to ask if it's possible, maybe we pause for 1 second to give the in-person participants a chance to ask any questions they might have for Ellen James.
Yeah.
Just put your hand up if you want to ask a question or share any reflections before we move on to the panel.
Yeah, I see one hand up. Yeah. Do you want to introduce yourself first, please?
Joy from Triangle with a social enterprise that creates the Outcome Star. Actually, I've just realised that my question relates to a question that was in the chat, which you won't have had a chance to see, but somebody was asking about what the purpose of the research was, and the answer was to identify when different kinds of outcomes-based contracts are most appropriate to use to kind of bring that evidence base to light. And my question was, will you also be looking at when an outcomes-based contract maybe isn't appropriate, when a different kind of contract would serve the intentions of the commissioner better?
Thank you.
My answer is sort of yes and maybe, almost, in terms of, yes, we're looking at different types of outcomes-based contracting, how they were used, when they were used, and when were they effective, and when weren't they effective. The thing that I always get nervous about, and I've seen it in the chat, it's totally understandable, that we're really synthesizing the current evidence that sits there. So if the evidence is able to show that different outcomes-based contracting used and one was more appropriate than the other, then that's a conclusion we can reach. Can we say this outcomes-based contract was not effective and this one should have been used? Well, the research probably won't tell us what should have been used. That's almost a normative view, unless they are categorically sort of compared. So I think we can go as far as the evidence can take us, really.
Okay, thanks, James. Elle, I think you wanted to chip in as well.
Yeah, just briefly to add, thanks, James, and thanks, Joy, for your question. I think we're hopeful that by keeping our gaze high and broad, we'll be able to answer lots of different research questions by focusing on sub-portions of the papers that we identify. So there's certainly some questions around effectiveness and comparing an outcomes contracting approach to more conventional funding mechanisms. There are a few papers that take quite a focused approach to trying to answer that question, and that might be something that we're able to distill and synthesize. But then these other questions around contextual appropriateness, different relational dynamics that we see on projects, that's going to be something that we have to take our time with, I think, and build up once we become more familiar with the full landscape and map of the studies that we have to hand. So this is going to be a very incremental piece, I think, but lots of questions that we hope to be able to answer with this as almost a data set in its own right.
Thanks, Elle. Carolyn, it's back to you now.
Sure. Yes, thank you so much. I think, the map might also be a great tool for us thinking about what are those next questions that we need to pursue. So I just want to, I'm going to start with one question to pose to our panelists, and then I will call on panelists to respond. So the first question was in reference to the kind of patchwork quilt analogy that James and Elle are using. The question is, have you seen different forms of outcomes contracts with ambiguity in linking these together? So the different forms of them. So what has been your experience? And I'm going to ask Jessica if she would be willing to go first.
Sure. Thanks very much, Carolyn. So first, I really want to applaud the efforts of Elle and James and the teams from Macquarie's and GoLab in this extremely ambitious and important undertaking, because while I would say results-based finance is pretty well established at this point, I think the very intentional focus on outcomes is relatively new. And this is, of course, the first global systematic review of its kind. And I think events like this are so critical in getting the word out that this kind of tool exists, because we can only continue to improve upon existing programs and reach the full potential of these types of approaches if we do follow the evidence. So, building on this discussion of the patchwork quilt of RBF instruments, this is something that, I'll perhaps kind of sheepishly admit that I'm quite passionate about. I even worked with Instiglio on an entire publication devoted to defining and breaking down each of the instruments. So under the umbrella of RBF, we have everything from output-based aid to performance-based finance, output-based disbursements, impact bonds, and so on and so forth. And our colleagues here identified multiple types of outcome-based contracting on the Jamboard. I think James said they've identified somewhere between 35 and 65. And he also mentioned that many of these instruments actually perform the same function, but are referred to differently depending on which organization uses them. And what I've learned is that this terminology really doesn't matter. No, I'm not at all saying that it's not important, of course, to understand how and in what context different models have been used. Again, looking to the evidence, not just following your nose. But I want to stress the point that when you're designing a project, the emphasis should be placed on the issue, not the instrument. And by focusing first on the underlying development challenge, you can then consider maybe an appropriate combination of instruments and metrics for the given context. I like to visualize a theory of change, starting with the intended program impact and then work backwards. What outcomes do you aim to achieve for beneficiaries? What outputs will lead to these outcomes? And then who needs to be incentivized to achieve these results? So ultimately, our objective is to incentivize the achievement of outcomes, tying payments to metrics as closely related to the ultimate development objective as possible, while still being realistic. And I think in the current pandemic environment, it's safe to say we've all learned that flexibility is critical. And in many cases, a hybrid approach using maybe a combination of instruments and metrics is what makes sense. And I think a good example of this is in Ghana, where the World Bank is working with the government of Ghana, FCDO, the Education Outcomes Fund. I know a couple of our colleagues are in this room right now on an outcome-focused education program designed to support out-of-school children to reintegrate into mainstream schools. And it takes the form of an impact bond, where a social investor provides the initial capital and is reimbursed upon the achievement of outcomes. But then COVID happened, while we're in the design stage. Schools closed, and the ability of the program to achieve the ultimate intended outcome, which is learning gains, was jeopardized. That's really a lot of risk to put on an investor. So we had to kind of move away from the pure impact bond approach, at least in the beginning, and think about a hybrid approach, including some more achievable outputs for the success of the program. And just to underscore, I think identifying these types of lessons in practice is why it's so important to study the evidence from past experiences when designing a new project. And I love the quote that Elle brought up, that we should take a scientific, systematic approach every time to looking for evidence. But don't get so wrapped up in following a particular model that was successful in one context that you forget about some of the most important aspects of RBF, which are flexibility and innovation. So I would say, perhaps provocatively, is that rather than committing to a specific instrument, whether it's a DIB, a SIB, OBA, or even traditional input-based models, perhaps the most successful projects are a patchwork quilt of financial tools themselves. So use the evidence, but design your own approach. I'll stop there.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Jessica. I know we're going to have people in the audience want to join in too, but I'd like to ask another of our panelists to bring the perspective that Chi-Hoon brings as someone with a lot of experience in commissioning support of outcomes-based contracting and impact bonds, and see if you can answer that same question about how the patchwork quilt analogy fits the work you've been doing.
Well, thanks, Carolyn. I think I would really agree with Jessica in that my starting point is always about what is it you're trying to achieve and what's the best way of getting there. And so to me, it's about what's the active ingredient here? What's the change mechanism that underpins this variety of 35 or 65 terms that we are using? Because actually the mechanisms and how they apply in different contexts would look quite different. And I'm not fussed about the terminology. I see a lot of these as adaptations so that they would make sense to local context, local stakeholders. So for example, I was just speaking to Russian colleagues last week, and they are trying to implement social impact bonds, but they're calling them social impact projects because in the Russian context now, the single biggest barrier to the market is investor aversion. So if you use a language that apes a financial instrument, it really goes nowhere and can actually do long-term damage for this endeavor. And then when I switch focus to say in the United Arab Emirates with Abu Dhabi, rather than calling things like social outcomes contracting, they are calling it social impact contracting. Why? Simply because it translates more intuitively in Arabic. There is a very easy map over in Arabic that people understand. So you really need to work with your ecosystem in terms of how do you make these things understandable to the people in your ecosystem? How do you drive these mechanisms in a way that actually plays to your ecosystem strength, while perhaps then over time plugging some of your ecosystem gaps? So a lot of the work I've been doing in, say, Japan or the Middle East, there are such aspirations in the UK to use outcomes contracting mechanisms, for instance, to partly stimulate the growth of the social sector. That's certainly one of the objectives that these kinds of instruments have been put to. Now, when you look at Abu Dhabi, in a lot of their social priority areas, they just do not have a social sector of providers, or there's so few of them and so small. So, you need to use these mechanisms with a longer term view about if you really want to drive the growth of the social sector, how do you use these instruments beyond a project type duration? In Japan, they've got a huge social sector, but much of it is very small, hyper-local, and they don't really want to engage in the big strategic outcomes types issues necessarily. So how do you actually make these mechanisms appeal to that kind of ecosystem that you're working with? So to me, it's always about the mechanism working in context. So I'll end there.
Excellent. Those were two really nice complementary discussions. So there is a question that has popped into the chat, and it says, what is the minimalist requirement in terms of institutional suitability for social outcome bonds to be used? And I don't know if either of our panelists who just spoke feel like they could answer that. Or another panelist. I might just,
if I may come in, I think probably what I'm about to say is very similar to what Chi-Hoon was just saying just now, that I remember having conversations in Latin America with Brazilian contingency and Colombia and others as well, where in many ways the challenge is that the impact bond was designed in an Anglo-Saxon system, and then they were looking at trying to introduce it into a completely different legal regulatory framework, or completely different context, and they were struggling to lift the impact bond, capital I, capital B, from the UK or the European context and bring it into theirs. And so they were changing it in different ways, slightly changing the laws, but also changing how things different operated so that it could work within their regulatory system. So I think the answer to that question is, in terms of what's the minimalist requirement, I don't necessarily think there is one. I think it's more about thinking about what your context is and how different forms of outcomes-based contracting could work within that context.
Can I just add to what James just said? I don't see this like a minimum viable product and what are the minimal requirements in terms of any objective characteristics that are just purely functional in any way. I look at them almost in terms of attributes. And I think any organization that engages in outcomes types contract probably needs to demonstrate a number of attributes, like you have an orientation towards evidence. You don't need to have the best evidence in the world, but you need to have an orientation towards evidence, recognizing the value of evidence, using evidence. The second attribute I would say is probably quite key is you need to demonstrate you are up for being very adaptive, for changing. I know of lots of outcomes-focused contracts that struggle or fail because they are awarded to, say, big names in the market that have been delivering certain things for 20, 30 years, and they're just going to keep delivering that till the cows come home. And actually, if it doesn't work in this specific context, you are supposed to flex, you are supposed to adapt, use that evidence. So you have to have, I think, organizations or entities with at least those two attributes.
Yeah, great points. Another question that was in the chat, I think kind of relates to this is as we mentioned that towards the beginning, right? The idea was that we were going to move towards thinking more about longer term contracts and outcomes that are sustainable, not just we get it, we achieve the goal, the benchmark, you get paid and you walk away and don't worry about what happens afterwards. So the question in the chat asks about how you ensure outcomes are sustainable and create long-term values through the process of generating outcomes.
Caroline, should we see if anyone in Oxford has any questions for any of the panelists? Hisham, put your hand up. Question or share reflections.
Yeah, that was a question from the chat I was reading.
Oh, back to you, Caroline. No questions from over here.
Okay, so yeah, the question I just read was from the chat, and I don't know if any of our panelists wants to speak to that about the longer term orientation, sustainability of outcomes.
I think one of the things that we're seeing is that there's a focus beyond a single contract. So we can evaluate these tools in and of themselves as a single contract, or we can think about them as tools for systems change. And I was thinking about this earlier when Chi-Hung was talking about the different objectives that are put at the door of these projects. They're enormously varied. Sometimes they're, very much focused on cashable savings, or certainly that was the argument of old. But increasingly, we're seeing them as a tool for driving systems change, a tool for integrating more adaptive approaches, and that's there in the literature, but quite difficult to code out systematically, is the different purposes that sit at the heart of these different approaches. So that's something that we're certainly beginning to investigate, but it's challenging to think about some of the evidence relating to the experience of a particular form of contracting, and some of it sitting as a wider comment on this as a tool within the landscape for reform.
Could I just build on what Elle said there? Because this really continues the conversation we had at one of the opening roundtables yesterday about how you can study each of these at the project level and make sense of them as a project. So how did this how did this contract work? How did this contract drive outcomes for these beneficiaries in the context of the constructs of that mechanism? But as Elle was talking about, and we discussed, and Louise is here, Haruka is here from the panel yesterday, what is less well articulated, I think in the literature, probably you have better articulations of the theories of change within each of these mechanisms as a discrete project. But what is less visible is the articulation of the theories of change of how these projects individually might be intended to trigger these range of more system level, strategic level outcomes. So that theories of change is poorly articulated. And certainly we haven't even started testing those assumptions along the way for that. But certainly in the discussions yesterday, there was a lot of discussion about you need to, if these are supposed to trigger systems change, you need to have clarity at the start about what are some of these system objectives. You need to involve and mobilize system players, not just the project players, both in the governance of the project, but also the wider governance around the projects. There are ways of working with the local ecosystem to embed, build capacity, use data to really drive adaptive practice.
Okay, great. I'd like to shift our discussion a little bit, and I want to turn to Jonathan. Jonathan, I know you have some remarks to make too, but I wanted to ask if you might be able to also comment on this question, which we have prepared, considering, based on your experience, how is evidence being used to support designing around outcomes-based contracting? And are people just following their noses, or are we using evidence?
Yeah, great. Thanks, Carolyn. And it's great to be here. I think I would echo a lot that's already been said, but perhaps take a different approach too, and just maybe emphasize the need for simplicity. So, you talk about that patchwork quilt, and to the extent that is articulated or introduced as something brand new to an existing system, an existing procurement or contracting system, I think that is oftentimes counterproductive as opposed to working within an existing system. So here's what I mean. So particularly from a donor agency perspective on innovative finance, I think it really just boils down, at least for USAID, to grant making. And so our default, or my default, that I try to impress upon my colleagues is to first always ask, why can't we just do this ourselves? Why do we need to introduce a third party, an upfront funder, an intermediary, an independent evaluator? I really think we need to do more to improve upon our own existing grant making within our existing rules and regulations. I also say, to the extent we can be innovative depends on our understanding of our own rules and regulations first. And going to the important point that Chi Hung mentioned about make it understandable to your ecosystem. I like that, because that includes our internal stakeholders. So when we're trying to put together a grant, which essentially goes into, perhaps supporting an impact bond structure or some other innovative finance structure, or again, on its own, you have to speak the language, so to speak, of the internal procurement team, then legal, programmatic, technical, and so forth, so forth. So very concretely, when we do grant making at USAID, the kind of grants that we provide, we try to simplify, yet there are still 31 steps. For example, we have a 31-step checklist to get through to make one of our grants. So if you think about this patchwork, adding on additional complexity and variability, you're adding complexity on top of an already complex bureaucratic structure. So for me, I think it's about simplicity, and I think innovation can be simple and simple can be innovative. So it's really about going back to the basics and saying, what is it that we're trying to accomplish at the end of the day? And can we do that through our existing instruments? And again, it's back to grant making, particularly federal grant making. And why that matters is in the US context, US government context, in fiscal year 2020, which ended last September 30th, pretty much the US government gave out close to $750 billion in grants. And when you apply that over, and USAID was one of the top US government agencies in providing grants. And so when we talk about innovative finance structures or development impact bonds, it's really just USAID providing a grant to support an impact bond structure. So that tends to get lost in the mix. And in terms of actually helping to move our money, if you will, it just boils back to simple grant making.
Excellent. I think, I guess there's one other question we talked about in terms of thinking about evidence is, so how can it best be shared to support social outcomes decision making? So, we have this big effort that's taking place at the Go Lab, and of course other places where we are generating evidence in across various sectors. As we talked about initially, there's so many different terms that are used, and we've been trying to look beyond those terms. But when it comes down to someone actually wanting to make a decision about whether it's to go down the path of social outcomes contracting, or when they're headed down that path, where to look, what is the best way for that evidence to be shared to support it? So, what we just saw is one model, and I don't know from your experience, Jonathan, or others on the panel, whether you would suggest other ways that we could be more effective in really making the exercise, creating the evidence worthwhile.
Yeah, I think that's an important question. I'll maybe chime in quickly, not specifically about what we can do, but maybe by issue. Something I still think we need to do better as an international development community is tying evidence linking outputs to outcomes, not necessarily just trying to pay for outcomes. And so what I mean by that is when it comes down to, again, simple grant making, you want to define the outputs, you want to be able to price those outputs, and then you want to be able to verify those outputs. That is going to be the simplest way to reduce variability and therefore disputes later on, as opposed to some more amorphous outcome you're trying to achieve. So for me, I feel like we need better evidence linking clean outputs to the outcomes we ultimately hope to achieve for purposes of facilitating more and better grant making, because ultimately a lot of the disputes that may arise will come around perhaps the verification process, how you price it, et cetera. And so if we can get better as a community about being sharper and saying these are generally the outputs that are causally linked to the outcomes we want to achieve in these sectors, I feel like that is a solid foundation and building block.
Yeah, that's great. I think it also speaks to, the point that was made earlier about the fact that being more inclusive in the work that's done in this review of the evidence allows for those opportunities to pick up on not just impacts or outcomes, but as you mentioned, inputs and others. So maybe other panelists want to weigh in on either the questions I've posed about the use of evidence.
I might step in then. I'd take a step back from what Jonathan was said, which I absolutely agree with, and is definitely part of the repertoire of what we do when we do commissioning support. But to zoom back out, I always think it's great that systematic review processes are robust and transparent, but ultimately, it's really about, does it make any difference? And that's a challenge in that question that Carolyn, you posed. And for me, working at the coalfield in international context, I'm always asking myself the question of what's useful and what's usable. And I think the answer to those two questions can look quite different in different contexts. And I remember that the scale of the challenge was so elegantly and compellingly framed by, was it Carol Weiss in the late 80s in the US, when she said that, for evidence-based policy and practice, just so you know, policymakers on Capitol Hill have 7 minutes a week to read anything. So, that's a challenge. And however we make this accessible, intuitive, it's really about, what drives that. And I'm always asking myself also, where do different types of people go for evidence and learning? And they go to very, very different places. So, zooming out at a really macro level, when we look at these sorts of things, and when I work with jurisdictions in the Middle East, for instance, they always go, right, let's benchmark against what the UK and US are doing. So they look at US, UK literature, there's a lot of that. But then they always say, but this isn't good enough for us because it doesn't actually tell us how to make it work in our context. So we need a second reframing to bring it closer to us. So they then look at the regional spheres of influence. They then go, so what's Saudi Arabia doing? What's Lebanon doing? What's Jordan doing? What's Egypt doing? So there are these steps that they undergo to translate, unpack, and make usable some of this evidence. And we have to be aware of that. There are different regional spheres of influence. And then when I zoom right into the very, very micro level, like supporting the Life Chances Fund here in UK, I cannot tell you the number of times people in local government would tell me, yeah, you know, the great stuff on the Go Labs website. I don't have time to read it. You have read it. Tell us what it says. So, you know, or they want to, can you plug us into another colleague in a local government that's done this before, and I'll talk to that person. That's how they define what's useful, what's usable. It has to be very, very much packaged to what their specific needs are in a specific context and what's credible to them. Where does this credibility come from?
Those are really helpful points. In my own experience, I remember we used to think that if we wrote 1 to 2 page research or policy briefs, that would do it. Now it's an infographic that we're often asked for, something that just simplifies. You can look at it and get the key point. Do others want to weigh in too?
Yeah, I just wanted to say one of my sort of favorite sort of studies that I looked at was the Education Endowment Fund, which is a foundation here in the UK that's all about understanding evidence in education interventions and then disseminating that evidence to head teachers and schools. And the Education Endowment Fund did an RCT on themselves. So they sent different information evidence to one set of schools, and they didn't send any evidence to another set of schools to look at, does the uptake of the interventions that they're showing have a good evidence base change when they provide evidence to some schools and when they don't? And they found limited impact. So actually sending evidence and showing what works doesn't always necessarily then inform decision making, because as Chi Hung said, people rely more on networks, on they may not read that evidence. So the key challenge that, as we've been grappling with, which is why we're sort of discussing this with everybody here, is how do you, even if you can find the evidence, even if you can then distill it in a way, how do you then get that into the hands of people and then try and encourage it to be used as well? Because it's not easy.
Yeah, and I want to call on James Magilwan. I see your hand up and would like to invite you to the discussion.
Thanks. Yeah, so I'm just going to sort of shout out for policymakers here, because it's not really lazy. We don't read stuff. But working for a government department, I can tell you that quote that Chi Hung made earlier about the time that you have to read stuff in depth is true. And I joked with Elle not long ago that as I was going on holiday that I would finally take some stuff away and read by the side of the pool, so that because I had some time to actually do it. But look, we do read stuff. I think the important thing is get the findings and the recommendations up front, because we have to think in practical terms. And I think Nigel touched upon this the other day when I was in Oxford, when he acknowledged the fact that decisions have to be made quickly, and they're having to be made all the time because of the practical nature of policy making. Now, that doesn't mean that we don't want them to be well-informed decisions, and it doesn't mean we don't want to have an evidence base in order to guide our ministers on what sorts of decisions they should be making. Obviously we do, because we're getting very hot water very quickly if we start giving them advice and guidance that's not well-founded. But I think you do need to think really carefully about the usability. And I know other people have talked about this, so I won't labour it, but do think about the usability. And I just put in the chat rather cheekily, maybe you need a kind of bit on the heat map, which is a practitioner's assessment of the usability of the different bits of research, because that would be really revealing against the kind of quality assessments you've put on the research itself. It would tell you a lot about the way the policymakers think, probably, but it gets that engagement in the research in a way which perhaps gives a different, puts a different complexion on the way that you rate it.
Excellent input. Do any panelists want to engage with James on that?
Just to thank you for the discussion, because I think it's important that we're, as researchers, really cognizant of the challenges around this. And yes, reading time is maybe constrained, but I also think it's valuable to have the conversation. So I think as part of this tool sits within a community, and we're all here now discussing the latest findings that might be coming through. So I think thinking about this as one tool among several in terms of how evidence sort of migrates and makes its way across the community is really important. And also just to underscore, I suppose, tracking back to this theme of the patchwork quilts, I don't think that this systematic review is ever going to do away with the need for really local appreciation of context and interpretation that helps identify the suitability of borrowing and learning from different models and different approaches. And I suppose that just brings us back to the title of the session, really, that it's the art and the science, and that there are some more sort of formalized ways that we can begin to synthesize, but there's always going to be that more kind of artisanal, local, important braiding together of that insight to put it in place and put it in practice.
Yeah, there's a related question or suggestion in the chat coming from Louise Sabella of Social Finance, who asks if whether you could create or allow a user rating of the usefulness of different studies that you compile in your database. So the idea would be that over time, it's kind of like you've seen those where you can like tap a button and say whether you're happy or not happy with certain, like, I don't know, you walk out of a cleanliness of a restaurant or something. And this asks, could you imagine users of the research presented in your compilation of studies and your ratings to tell you whether or not they found particular studies useful. And then over time, then you would have the input from those tapping into the database to take that into consideration or maybe use that information.
Carolyn, if I come in, I was just I was reading that in the chat, just thinking, and originally I thought, that's a really great idea. But my nervousness, I think it goes back to the quote that Elle shared at the beginning of her presentation about Ben Goldacre around the rationale for doing systematic review, is that the risk is, I think his quote is almost, you mooch through the evidence, picking the bits that look most interesting or possibly confirm with your own views. And what the whole point of systematic review is to try and avoid confirmation bias, that people read the studies that they probably, speak to them. And someone in the chat was talking about, could you filter this by critiques? So where it shows that they don't work. But then I was saying, well, the problem is if you think they don't work, you're going to go to this. You're going to filter by studies that don't work, read a load of studies that show they don't work and conclude that they don't work, rather than reading studies that show that they do work. And my nervousness with that suggestion is you have the same risk that people will like the studies that speak to their views they already have. So if most people that access this systematic review think SOCs are great, and the load of there's 10 studies that conclude they're great, they'll like them. And then everybody goes and reads the studies that are liked, and you get this echo chamber, and it risks kind of breaking down the whole point of doing systematic review. So there's definitely lots we have to think about here about how to make it accessible, point people to the relevant stuff, whilst also making sure that it's digested in a systematic way. So I don't know if it's a good idea or not. I don't know what other people think.
Yeah, it'd probably have to be something more than just a thumbs up, thumbs down type of thing to really be useful. There is one other, I think, helpful comment that I think is something we haven't talked about, but I think would be important to consider. This comes from Russ Wood, and he's talking about the role of advisors or intermediaries. So, at least in social impact bonds, there's a very formal role for intermediaries, but in general, in outcomes-based contract, he points out that their role is often key because, like, the social service providers themselves won't necessarily have research teams that maybe can consume those things. So maybe if, I don't know, Jessica or you or someone else could maybe speak to what you see as the role of the advisors and intermediaries in helping kind of that evidence seep through and be useful.
Absolutely. And I'm very sorry I had to step away for a moment, but I'm definitely happy to jump back into the conversation. The role of intermediaries and advisory organizations is critical. And Carolyn, just as you said, a lot of times, the funding agency, the donor agency, the government that you're working with don't necessarily have the time or the resources to go and dig into all this research. GoLab and Akoris, you've made this much more simple with your global systematic review, but I think the knowledge and kind of the dedicated time that these intermediary teams are able to bring are crucial. As I think many of us understand that the design of the contract in the beginning is critical to its success. And so if you're not looking to all of the evidence that comes before you, you're definitely decreasing your chances of success. I will say in terms of evidence, I think up until this point, there really hasn't been one go-to resource. And so as other colleagues, I believe, have mentioned, a lot of times you don't know where to go. So you go with what you know. You talk with your own colleagues, you think about projects that you yourself have worked on in the past. Thinking about impact bonds specifically, there's a lot of evidence on impact bonds working in developed countries, but not a lot of evidence of them working in developing countries because there just isn't a lot of experience. So I really encourage everyone working on these types of programs, to include a thoughtful evaluation of the program from the beginning. And I'm not just talking about a formal evaluation, which is extremely important, but also take a step back during the design process even and think about some of the lessons that you've learned. I know this has been critical with the Ghana project and with the World Bank because this type of approach is extremely nascent within the World Bank. And it's been a huge learning curve for everyone involved. And so kind of documenting the lessons and challenges that we've come across and how we address them has been extremely important.
Excellent. Thanks so much. I've been trying to kind of keep track of questions. Are there any other questions in the room that maybe have come up and I haven't seen?
We have a hand up here in the audience.
Hello, my name is Steve Hindle. I work at the Elton John AIDS Foundation. And thinking about the title of our session, it talks about art. And I'd like to honour the emotional side of these kind of contracts. I'd be interested to know whether there is any place within the systematic review around quality of relationships, because these contracts are negotiated by individuals. They have their own beliefs, their own values, and their own career aspirations. And they are housed within organizations that have their own cultures. And we tend to think of this perhaps as risk appetite, but it's also about the ability to manage ambiguity. It's about the ability to sustain anxiety in the face of board level disapproval. And I'd be interested to know whether we can explore any of that through the systematic review, because I think, as was mentioned earlier, these are tools. And to some extent, a bad tool in the hands of good people will still perform well.
I jump in here. I love that, Steve, because I always say, working in any kind of commissioning support, including outcomes-based contracting, it's a blend of the technical and the relational. And so much of the focus tends to be on the technical, like describing the models, the data, how you model this, etc. And so much less of the attention is on the relational. And yet every year we get together and talk about the importance of partnerships, of relationships, where we don't actually systematically shine a light on how these things work. And when Caroline put up those two pictures of the men in the suit and the men in the dress, I was quite tempted to turn up today dressed as photo B, because I always thought, I describe what I do as always dancing on the edge of chaos, because you're working these complex cultures and systems, both within any single organization, but also to make this work, you are dancing across those different worlds that don't normally come together. It's bad enough doing it in one organization, which is so siloed, even with the best intentions. So how do these people help work these relationships. And I always look at the examples of how sometimes projects fail right before they're about to be launched, or even shortly after they launch, and actually how many of those could be traced back to really charismatic people who were involved in, the ideation and the corralling and the mobilizing. And then when these people leave, the whole thing falls apart. So there are these, sorcerers, but there are also things about the wider system, both within organizations and external to that. I think some of this links to what Russ was saying earlier, and Jessica, about some of these have advisors in their job titles in different forms, but I think it's much bigger than that. And I think the relational aspects are really important to interrogate, because there are lots of good things about managing good relationships, partnerships, the quality of relationships, but in linking to what we've just been talking about credibility, where people go for learning and evidence, there's also a risk where sometimes things get institutionalized, practice get institutionalized, relationships, models get institutionalized before they are ready. Innovation gets locked down because people just want to replicate certain types of partnerships, certain types of models. And then you do see in different contexts how certain models of these work get locked in to reflect certain vested interests, which might be state, which might be a commercial intermediary interest. So I think relationship really is a very big area that will make a plea for us all to shine more of a light on, because they're critical for making these work, but there are also a lot of inherent risks.
Thanks so much. James, you want to go ahead?
Yeah, just building on that, I think I totally agree with everything Steve just said. And I think bad tool in the hands of good people can still work was a great quote. I think the wider point that Steve is making and other people have made is that context is king. And there's a danger here that if you look too much at the tool in isolation and you aggregate different studies looking at the same tool, you conclude that the tool works or the tool doesn't work, when actually it's the tool within the particular context. And as Steve said, we could conclude that it works because it was a good tool, but maybe it was a bad tool and it worked because the people, the relationships were really strong. So I totally agree. The wider point, I think, is that we really have to think about the context within which these are operating. The challenge we have, which I think was the point I made earlier to the question that Joy made, is with the systematic reviews, we're not actually doing the new research. We're looking at research that's already been done and trying to pull that together. So if nobody's looked at relationships, we can't say these work when relationships are strong and when they're not strong if no one's looked at them. So we can definitely try and look at these things, and we can definitely, and this is what I perhaps didn't say earlier, is all of this, we're sort of co-designed, that group of 35 funders that I talked about, we formed a sort of policy advisory group, and we're co-designing the study with them in terms of what should we be looking for, what's important to you. So these kinds of comments are really helpful. We can look for, is quality of relationships picked up? Does that seem to impact on the quality of the tool? But the challenge we have is if that hasn't been researched, we can't say. So we're sort of beholden to what the evidence already tells us.
Thanks. Can I just add one more comment, Carolyn, that also brings in another question from the chat?
Sure, go ahead. Oh, yeah, and then there's someone who's been waiting to unmute, so I'll go to him next.
Thank you. So I just want to echo, James's points around, we're surfacing what's out there at the moment. But what I would say is that so much of the research is beginning to key into these as structural tools, but that enable purposeful partnerships to come together. So I think we see more of this coming together of a technical conversation and a relational conversation in the research, and there'll be more of that gets surfaced as we begin to compile and bring together these studies. So the way in which we talk about these things, I think, is evolving, and I think the research is absolutely beginning to detect that. I can already think of some papers that draw on cultural theory to examine the different perspectives of stakeholders around particular projects, and they will all be there in this systematic review. But a great question. Thanks, Steve. The other thing that I wanted to pick up on is a question from James Copestake in the chat around...
that's what I wanted to go to next.
Great,
yeah. Do you want to unmute yourself and ask the question, or do you want Eldis to go forward?
I don't know what the question is.
Well, you were commenting on your experience of systematic reviews and where the evidence is focused quite narrowly on a small number of cases, I think. What's your experience there?
Yeah, I mean, prompted by Joe Stevens yesterday, I've been reflecting on the parallel in terms of the early evolution of microfinance and its eventual morphing into financial inclusion, partly as a way of changing the goalposts as it developed. And just remembering on the sort of openness and fluidity of the community that brought academics and practitioners together. And I'm sort of feeling a resonance, sort of some happy memories of those days. So that's great. And reflecting on how different ways of collecting evidence, including some quite heavy systematic reviews, contributed to that. So I think there is a bit of a danger because we do have incentives to hitch our flag to models that are in the ascendancy of these kinds of global events privileging some models over others. So in the case of microfinance, of course, we have Grameen and the credit-led, the savings-led models got eclipsed, and we rediscovered VSLAs, as some of us heard yesterday. And then, of course, it was all about payment-led models and M-Pesa. And then suddenly, we were all busy focusing on different models of financial transactions, and social protection came up out of left field and became a much more prominent way of thinking, and we all moved to cash transfers. And so the systematic reviews can help us appreciate the diversity of models and why some work in different contexts. And I think that's valuable, but let's also have half an eye to the activity-based contracting and the others. So we're not just looking at, even with our 35 different or 57 varieties of baked beans, we're not looking, just at those which have to have the performance. We can have half a mind to what the options are as well. My other reflection is on the role of us academics. I'm delighted that there aren't too many pure academics in the room, as practitioners. But I teach this stuff to final year students and postgraduates, and I'm partly here because it's about time I did something than give them Paul Plist's article on performance-based contracting as principal agent problem and the insolvability of the multitask problem. So I'm here for new material, but actually a lot of systematic review does end up with a bit of middle range theory, refuted or refined or expanded. And there is a body of middle range theory about this field, which we haven't talked about much, and which will be influential, particularly if the economics profession is behind it. And so we just have to accept that actually what we're partly doing here as practitioners may be rethinking what is the good theory behind what we do. And that's what we're trawling the literature for. Sorry, that wasn't a question at all, but I hope it's a useful contribution.
Thanks for that, James. Ellen, do you want to add anything? And then I'll hand things back to Caroline.
I thought that was really helpful introduction. Thanks, James. And yes, we'll have to work with practitioners, I think, to ensure that we're attuned to these different models that are happening under similar banners. I'll leave it there, though. I think there's so much more of this conversation to be had. But Caroline, sorry, we're mic hogging here.
I think this has been a fantastic discussion. I know there are still comments happening in the chat. Keys Cools just put a provocative question up there, just thinking about how, this is still a relatively small sector. And I think this was actually mentioned earlier too. Someone just talked about the scale with which we are in general contracting, and we're still, this outcomes-based contract is still a relatively small part of it. And, maybe, this kind of work, the systematic review will tell us, what is that potential for this becoming bigger going forward, and maybe it's all a part about whether or not we are able to make the evidence really useful and give people opportunities to learn so that we can advance scaling and expansion. So I think I just want to thank, first of all, our panelists who've been fantastic. I want to thank our audience. It wouldn't be a discussion without your willingness to jump in and challenge us with really wonderful questions, including those of you who posted in the chat. There was a lot of active conversation going there. And I also want to thank our hosts, the Go Lab and the Blavatnik School, for continuing to bring us together, to pulling together panels that bring such a diverse group of people from so many different sectors, and helping us to appreciate each other's perspectives and what we contribute to the conversation. So just thanks to everybody for being here today for this panel.
Thanks, Carolyn.